I want to thank the entire community of ICM for their flexibility with rescheduling my visit because of problems with my back, this bridge called my back, that I've been having earlier this term. And I want to give my abundant thanks to Molly Kirker. Can you come back and organize my life for me back in Princeton? I would love that. In the Society for the Humanities, thank you to Tim Murray for welcoming me into that community today, to Nita Eidsham for sharing her brilliant work, and in my opinion, revolutionizing sound studies, to Megan and Emily, and especially Barbara Friedman, who actually were my PowerPoint guardian angels earlier today. It's been a real journey. I especially want to thank, that probably wasn't good for recording, right? But I especially want to thank Professor Mary Pat Brady, who's been a longtime intellectual hero of mine, as well as an old friend who's really modeled for me a kind of cutting-edge interdisciplinary scholarship that I admire and seek to emulate in my own work. Lots of friendly faces here, Jeremy Braddock. I'm really pleased to see everyone. Lest this turn into a Cuba Gooding Jr. Oscar speech, I want to quickly add a last round of thanks to my RAs back at Princeton, Cameron and Francisco, and especially Eric. They do incredible work for me, and were so helpful to me with this project. Finally, last thing I want to say before I start the timer, I want to emphasize or point out that this talk is not the length of the actual musical Porgy and Bess, God help us. But it does run with clips for about 50 minutes or so. With audio and video clips, you could turn into the Apollo Theater Sandman and pull me off, or someone can raise their hands if it's starting to look ugly. But I'll tell you in terms of markers, that when we reach the multiple jazz women's covers of Summertime, we are around the bend and we are closing in on the ending. Okay? All right, so we'll just see how it goes, and I'll watch my time here. Okay, all right. Yeah. Oh, I meant to put this up first, too. And again, we've changed the title because this is kind of where my work is at for this book right now, and I'm happy to talk more about that at the break. But let's go ahead and go. All right. So it wasn't a problem for Whitney back in the day and at the height of her masterful vocal powers. Our Lady of the 80s turned that oh-so-familiar pastoral aria into a slow drag come-on, a quiet storm supplication strewn with flirtatious ornamentation and fitful sensuality. Whitney's Summertime is all heat and pure fever, right down to the Godfather meets Mahalia handkerchief, an ode to adoring partnership and endless grown folks' love, affirmed once and for all with the ad-libbed declaration at the end of this clip, "I got my man." Now, let us put aside the troubling phantom figure of Bobby Brown here for a minute to focus instead on the ways that the Princess of Pop revels in a kind of playfulness characteristic of her post-soul sisters who've tackled this classic, at last count, with 25,000 plus covers and counting, the most recorded song of all time. Familiar to most in our present day is Fantasia Barrino's star turn on Idol. One of only 3 African-American champions on the show where black musicking lives, without all that many black people. Fantasia rocked the cradle of Summertime by way of interpolating her North Carolina-bred gospel aspiration into the affective economy of the song. Hear how she transforms a tune that traditionally and historically expresses a romanticized, static, and unchanging black pastoral South, where fish are hopping and the cotton is high, and where characters embrace a kind of ironic, melancholic, yet tentative hopefulness. Your daddy's rich and your ma's good looking, so hush little baby, doesn't cry. Fantasia's defiant emphasis on the song's most transcendent lyric, a line that forecasts the moment of spreading one's wings and taking to the sky, turns a song that ostensibly savors the rural splendor of Jim Crow Southern living into a determined articulation of spiritual flight and possibility. And ever the golden light of the sun ebullience, Jill Scott swings and scats her way through a buoyant duet with George Benson that figures Summertime as a redemptive joint meditation on the power of parental love and protection, whose joyous energy is so potent that one can almost see the infant raised up before the heavens to behold the only thing greater than him or herself. Or consider the luminous Bahamian-born Angelique Kidjo's ethereal rendition in her native phone, an intricate polyphonic hummingbird's tale that floats and gently rocks us around the diaspora and into a lush, dreamy new dawn. Each of these artists tapped into the wide open spaces of George Gershwin and novelist turned playwright turned lyricist Dubose Hayward's operatic cradle song, each willing her own uniquely virtuosic abilities to the center of the tune. Yet in spite of the nowness of Summertime, its persistence as a standard that numerous Black women musicians have turned to and expressed myriad forms of assured interpretive agency, it should come as little surprise that the road that Black women have traveled singing numbers from the Gershwin's folk opera ain't been no crystal stair. Best to recognize that what we're listening to now, what we're watching, are artists who are currently reaping the benefits of generations of Black women musical geniuses who have, for over 75 years now, confronted and covered, immersed themselves in, but also resisted, rewritten, and re-inhabited the behemoth albatross that is Porgy and Bess. Black folks have been wrestling with the musical theater meets operatic wail since the show's debut in 1935, celebrating it like J. Rosamond Johnson, James Weldon Johnson's bro, did when he called it, quote, a monument to the cultural aims of the Negro, chastising it like Duke Ellington did when he infamously declared that the times are here to debunk Gershwin's lamp black Negroisms, or trying to reject it altogether, as did Sidney Poitier, clearly unsuccessfully, when the role of Porgy was offered to him in the ill-fated 1959 Otto Preminger film adaptation. As music scholar Gwen Cooner-Brown points out in her fun new work on the collaborative history of Porgy and Bess, this is a show that African-American performers have engaged from the beginning, helping to create and shape it in a variety of ways, taking roles or refusing them, and deepening our understanding of its various meanings through analysis, criticism, and commentary. The grooves in the archival record reveal the extent to which Black actors and vocalists return again and again to Porgy and Bess, a grandly ambitious symphonic experiment in both racial mimicry as well as interracial encounter, a dual dynamic that I'll discuss a bit ahead. Called repeatedly by critics of yesteryear and today America's greatest opera, James Baldwin didn't agree with that, Porgy and Bess was penned by George and Ira, the New York City sons of Russian Jewish immigrants who partnered with the very Goy, Charleston, South Carolina native Dubose in picking up the sounds of Harlem, the Lower East Side, and the Gullah Sea Islands, and recording an epic listening that sought to capture the complexity of America's modern moment through an immersion in Negro soundscapes. From its earliest performances, when the libretto was riddled with the N-bomb, to its most recent and controversial revival this season as musical theater in the Great White Way, Porgy and Bess is a show that continues to both trouble and encapsulate American culture's canonical tales of racial aesthetic power and appropriation to such an extent that post-civil rights era Black cast, and much more often than not their white directors, have had to negotiate its terms like a theatrical salt treaty. Which begs the question, why bother? And more to the point for my purposes today, what specifically does this text offer Black women performers, from actresses who played the legendary role of Bess to vocalists and musicians who transformed that character's sonic repertoire into an alluring, abstruse riddle, a socio-political, cultural, historical, and aesthetic problem, as well as an opportunity. This afternoon, my intent is to consider the avant-garde sonic cartography of Bess, a role that, according to the opera scholar Rosalind Story, has helped to set in motion the careers of many a Black diva, and a figure who, along with other female characters in this folk opera, produced a sonic tapestry of aesthetic possibility for experimental Black women musicians. Today, I'm asking, what is Porgy and Bess, this grandly imposing hybrid musical text, offered Black women artists, and what have these artists done to deform the Gershwin form? My aim here is to use this classical meets musical theater text as a way to question, in the spirit of folks like Judith Jack Halberstam, Jose Munoz, Tave Nyong'o, and others, what is the time and space of sonic avant-garde Black womanhood, and why and how does this show potentially open up alternative possibilities with regards to time, space, and sound for Black women artists? So I'll first briefly reconsider regional and aesthetic influences that inform the making of Porgy and Bess, as well as the largely overlooked Black female aesthetic cultural context in which Gershwin cultivated his epic. I'll also reconsider the resonant utility of Bess's character as a figure on the outside of the fictional community of Catfish Row and in transition to the sporting life of New York, the big city. Thinking of Bess as an in-between migrant woman who flows, to cite both Vera Griffin as well as Francisco Robles, I argue opens up rather than closes down her putatively fatal New York futurity at opera's end. In the second half of my discussion, I'll explore the ways that a range of artists have reinterpreted the role of Bess so as to improvise the radical musical ontology of her character and to locate and animate musicologist Guy Ramsey, what musicologist Guy Ramsey would refer to as the Afro-modernist experimental possibility coursing through this dense and deeply troubling text. So I'm interested in kind of the idea of an archetype, a literary and theatrical archetype becoming a kind of sonic praxis for Black women musicians in particular. Finally, if there's time, I'll explore the ways that Bess's figurative in-betweenness anticipates a long line of future artists who would push formalistic boundaries in their own performances. What I'm ultimately arguing here is that the greatest untold secret history, Pace Grail Marcus, of Porgy and Bess is, in my mind, the ways that it persists as a sonic template for Black women musicians to engage with and find unlikely, dissonant beauty in the condition of being outside and on the fringe. So the old school way to tell the tale of Porgy and Bess's origins goes a little something like this. Charleston resident DuBose Hayward grows up with the sound of Gullah on his mother Janie's tongue. A white widow turned Black folk tale writer, Janie earns a living for the family by writing books like Songs of the Charleston Darky in 1912. Hayward picks up the torch and turns racial mimicry and discursive vernacular practice into a family affair in 1925 when he publishes Porgy, a novel supposedly inspired by the lore of a local, impoverished, and disabled African-American man embroiled in a possible lover's quarrel that results in attempted murder. Now, George Gershwin falls in love with Porgy, the novel, a book he devours and begins to transform into a musical score in the late 1920s as he continues to experiment during his young composer years with ways of merging his Tin Pan Alley chops with Black sonic idioms, and likewise as Hayward turns his novel into a successful Broadway play in 1925. In their own joint adaptation of the text into a folk opera, which begins in earnest in 1933, the Gershwins, along with Hayward, deepened and showcased the angle of the love triangle between a, quote, crippled beggar, Porgy, a drug-addicted strumpet, Bess, as she was often described by contemporary critics of the opera, and her brutish, hypersexualized lover, Crown, who struggles to seize back control of Bess as she falls for Porgy and as she contemplates a life free of the happy dust supplied by her pusher sport in life. All of this set against the backdrop of the fictional Catfish Row, a world of rural Black squalor where tight-knit community nonetheless endures. Spectacular tragedy of operatic proportions ensues. Thus, Porgy and Bess just grew. Sometimes I crack myself up, right? Porgy and Bess just grew out of the hands of its composer, George, and its lyricist, brother Ira and DuBose, the latter of whom supplied his own soul lyrics to some of the show's signature songs, including Summertime, My Man's Gone Now, and A Woman Is a Sometime Thing. In October 1935, Porgy and Bess debuts, first at Boston's Colonial Theater, followed by Broadway, where it runs for a disappointing, by musical theater rather than opera standards, 124 shows before closing. In his first and last opera before succumbing to a brain tumor at the age of 38, Gershwin, like many of his white bohemian peers, was chasing a jazz idea. As he describes it, quote, the spontaneous expression of the nervous energy of modern American life. Modern life is, alas, not expressed by smooth phrases. We are living in an age of staccato, not legato. The result was a production that bristled with formalistic complexity and cultural cross-pollination. And as an aside, all of these points should render irrelevant Stephen Sondheim's now infamous concerns in the New York Times last summer about spoiling the authenticity of a text that is fundamentally shaped out of the grist of Black cultural forms. I could talk about Sondheim all night if you want me to later on. Hayward and the Gershwins rode the dissonant edge of modern musicking hard in their work, offering their mannered interpretations of the blues, crossed with spirituals, crossed with jazz, Tin Pan Alley, and classical. I need Nina to help me out with this word. I want to say recitatives, isn't it? There's an Italian for anyone, recitatives? That's how I said it, but then Alicia Hall Moran, who's the understudy for Bess, was like, give me the Italian way, and I'm like, ooh, I can't do that. So, okay, great, thank you. Canonic techniques and the leitmotif. And it was a project that was polarizing from the start. There were the critics, some of whom were unsettled by its Negro folksiness, all mixed up in classical fugues and arias. Others who were undone by vaudeville musical theater and Harlem cabaret jazz, infusing itself into the form of the opera. And that's just the white folks. Prominent African Americans, reactions to the show range from the aforementioned Ellington's write-off to that of sociologist Harold Cruse, to Lorraine Hansberry, who was featured in a Variety 1959 article entitled Lorraine Hansberry Deplores Porgy. Most recently, in his brilliant review of the latest revival, New Yorker critic Hilton Alice put it succinctly by observing that this, quote, show about black people created entirely by white people has never been a favorite of black audiences. In traditional stagings, the characters Porgy and Bess come together amid their community's will to destruction. There is no uplift, just sweat, blood, carnality, and resignation. Very boldly, yeah, it's his reading. Black suffering, bizarre sexuality, as Al refers to it, sonic blackface hokum. This is the racial mountain that we're asked to climb so often when attending a night at this particular opera. Today, though, I'm interested in climbing a different rock, perhaps like the chick in the Chase Bank commercials, because what I'm wondering is whether or not there's another generative method of listening to the ways that this production archives interracial encounter in sound, and also creates spaces where black women performers might improvise heroically complex, opaque, and mischievous ways of sounding out their subjectivities. By opening up readings of Porgy and Bess beyond and yet deeply connected to blackface discussions, what might we find? Ahead, I want to suggest that there's a way to both recognize the menstrual legacies that inform the production of this text and to also complicate how we discuss this dynamic and sonic cultural context. If, for instance, we were to examine this text from the standpoint of Hayward and the Gershwins striving for a form that could articulate the ineffable feeling bound up with interracial sonic identifications, then what might we hear and see anew in the text? And likewise, if we were to equally take into consideration Kuna Brown's important research that reveals the extent to which African American performers have played an indispensable, active, collaborative, she says rather than contentious, but I'm interested also in the contentiousness of the role in the production of Porgy and Bess since its inception in 1935. So if we took into consideration the ways that black casts are actively collaborative in the making of the musical, where might this take us in tracing the dynamic ways that black musicians have both informed and drawn from the Porgy and Bess canon, spinning its moving parts into Afro-modernist musical practices. From this standpoint, New York Times op-ed critic Joe Nocera's observations that Porgy and Bess has been a, quote, a reflection of race relations in America and a prism through which African Americans have viewed their own history would seem to be both a facile and an inadequate assessment, since it is the kind of familiar claim that obscures the complexities of white artists listening to and compositionally remixing black sound, as well as the black artists who listened to and found inventive ways of reinterpreting these recordings and recodings. So this, I argue, is the dynamic that comprises the work that is and continues to be in its ongoing iterations Porgy and Bess. Interracial encounter and palimpsested interracial listenings that require us to follow my colleague Alexandra Vasquez's recourses and listen in detail. So pace Jeff Melnick and his cogent work on Gershwin, the B-side of this talk, slips on the headphones and takes up the situation of Baby George on the Lower East Side playground of PS 25, as the fabulous music critic Alex Ross recounts it, listening to the sound of a fellow student playing Dvorak's Humoresque piano cycle, a work based on the American plantation dances of his young student Maurice Arnold, one of those would-be black composers, Ross points out, who had dropped out of sight in the archive. It returns as well to the scene of 20-year-old George composing the Stephen Foster-inspired minstrel redux Swanee on an uptown bus ride in 1919, and as the 20s unfolded, rolling to Harlem with the other au faits to hear the likes of stride piano extraordinaire James P. Johnson and others. And it especially pays attention to Gershwin in his 30s and deep in the throes of writing his opus, taking up quarters on Folly Island, and along with Hayward, heading to, quote, according to the New York Times, a Negro meeting shouting along with the worshipers and catching the beat instinctively and later working it into his music. That's from a 1935 Times article. If we keep the volume turned up on Porgy and Bess so as to catch the sound of this history, so as to recapture the phenomenon of racialized notation embedded in this text, how might this alter what we ultimately hear? If we move away from Sondheim's historically myopic conception of this text and toward a recognition of the Gershwins and Hayward's participation in a long tradition of racialized transcription, what kind of other stories might we be able to tell? As music theorist Ron Rodano observes of this history, seeking to capture the peculiarities of African-American vernacular singing, transcribers altered staff notations to obey a new logic that exceeded the confines of common time and well-tempered scales. Rodano argues that the disciplining effects of notation accordingly engendered a kind of counter-violence that related directly to the impossibility of the transcription. Seeking to master, notation succumbed only to enhance and finally to concretize a modern conception of black difference. And to be sure, Hayward and the Gershwins walked a complicated line in the business of notating and transcribing black vernacular sound and oscillating between notational violence and reverence, what we might think of as a kind of Derridian archival violence. And in the larger project, I'm interested in pushing our analysis of what Al's insightfully reads as the cultural context in which a show like Porgy and Bess, which takes place in an isolated black realm, a kind of tropical ghetto, as he calls it, is part of a long tradition of white composers and lyricists presenting their ideas of blackness to one another. We, of course, have to recognize the ways that this show is part of a long tradition of European Jewish immigrants of a different color, using black cultural forms to become white, to cite the work of Matthew Floyd Jacobson, Jeff Melnick, and others. Crucial points to consider in any exploration of Porgy and Bess, however, not my primary concern today. Instead, I'd like to flip to the A side in order to think about what Gershwin may have learned from black women's avant-garde performances that both directly and indirectly shaped the cultural context in which Gershwin developed his production. I'll then consider some of the ways that black women artists have taken up the challenge of performing an aesthetically demanding work that called upon them to tap into their most heterogeneous virtuosic abilities, to be able to sing in wide vocal ranges and with great physical stamina, folk, Broadway, opera, and spirituals, while also asking of them to simultaneously reinscribe the most familiar of black female caricatures. What I'm ultimately suggesting is that these women, in various versions of the show, innovated ways of turning the clashing tension between the sonic form of Bess and the content of her caricature into an experimental genre unto itself. These women ultimately strategized ways of scoring the conditions and possibilities of being aesthetically on the edge and outside, and passed that secret on to generations of artists who followed the paths that they paved. So we've got the ethnographic Lomaxian white man in the Black South hanging with the real folks story down pat, thanks to a great new book by cultural theorist Sonnet Retman. We know the tales of Gershwin with Hayward on Folly Island, trying to keep the beat with the Negro masses and turning that into theatrical gold, even if we've never heard the specifics of that anecdote before. But what are the women who were making dissonant noises all around George Gershwin in the years leading up to Porgy and Bess? What kind of a musical conversation might Gershwin have been striking up with them in his work? What about women like Florence Mills? Baby Flo, as she was affectionately called, the Broadway musical ingenue who took Manhattan by storm in the groundbreaking 1921 show Shuffle Along. It was Mills who, at the behest of her friend, the genius composer William Grant Still, teamed up with him on a winter's night, January 24th, 1926, at Aeolian Hall in New York City to perform Still's four-song cycle, Levyland, a modern suite for voice and chamber orchestra, 12 musicians, and a boldly inventive concert piece that radically broke away from black vaudevillian stage business to experiment with the seeds of symphonic jazz. Featuring a cluster of pieces by distinguished composers, the event was presented by the International Composers Guild with its aim of promoting avant-garde music. Hailed by the New York presses as a Harlem heroine who went artistic, Mills's move toward the experimental gives us an early precursor to the kinds of artistic risks that women like Abby Lincoln and Nina Simone and Nona Hendryx would take in the decades ahead. That night, she interpreted Still's range of abstruse, melancholic, defiant, and humorous songs by way of her dexterous vocalizing. As Mills biographer Bill Egan vividly recounts, from Levy's song, the first in the set, a lover's bluesy lament for her neglectful man, to the mid-tempo Hey Hey, a tune with a vocal consisting solely of the title's words, spoken in shifting affective registers, described by audience members as Mills shifting from surprised to questioning to disgusted, with that one word that she was using, to croon, a wordless hum set to a very slow vocal line. These were songs that went to the place where words don't go, to cite my intellectual hero Fred Moden, Her performance seemingly flirted with what Brent Edwards might call the syntax of scat as it emerged in the same year that Satchmo would record his pioneering heebie-jeebies tune that likewise mobilized syllabic fragments of language. Like Armstrong, Flo used wordless sounds as abstract linguistic forms, as critical modes of inquiry. And the audience that night, consisting of celebs like Arturo Toscanini, Carl Van Vechten, James Weldon Johnson, Walter F. White, Mrs. Otto Kahn, and wait for it, Gershwin himself, they were listening. Egan goes as far as to speculate whether Mills's performance of the Backslider, the last piece in the set, and in his assessment, the most dramatic of the four, may have, quote, stimulated some ideas in George Gershwin's mind for his future Porgy and Bess. That particular song, which chronicled the familiar black urban naturalist horror story of a fallen woman who loses herself to jazz, Mills speculates, quote, could well serve as an anthem for Bess. But Ladyland would not have been the sole model for black women's musical experimentalism available to Gershwin in the run-up to Catfish Row. No doubt, in the early 1930s, it's likely that he would have heard something about Shirley Graham, the Oberlin alum and youthful composer who made a splash in the world of classical music when her diasporic opera Tom Tom, an epic of music and the Negro, debuted in Cleveland in 1932. Graham, still about a decade away from her serious involvement with future husband, W.E.B., was the first African-American woman, Du Bois, I should say that right, first African-American woman to compose an opera for a major professional organization, the Stadium Opera Company, a precursor to the Cleveland Metropolitan Opera. And the waves of approval that she received in the press made its way back to New York art circles as evidenced by archival letters and clippings. Did Gershwin know about Graham's production, a work that music scholar Sarah Schlaminger describes as having featured an entire black cast embracing the spirit of diaspora as a beacon of diversity that will heal the wounds of their collective past and guide them towards a prosperous and peaceful future? We can't say. But what we can do is point to the way that Graham was busy at work some 3 years before Porgy's debut, and even longer when one takes into consideration her undergraduate early drafts of the libretto and score, on an opera that showcased a diversity of musical styles, and one that featured a sub-narrative in which a character called Girl initially chooses a life in a Harlem cabaret before reuniting with lover, mother, and community, and marching toward the horizon in a third act that sparkles, as the press called it, with energetic jazz, cabaret, folk, and blues music, as black folk, rural and urban, poor and rich, spirit-filled and low-down, all come together to question the meaning of Africa. As the New York Times, quoting the Cleveland Press, would state of Tom Tom in a preview on June 19, 1932, it features, quote, a harmonic scheme and an orchestration increasingly complex to match the growing complexities of the drama itself, culminating in atonalities accompanying the final New York scenes in which orchestras, spirituals, and jazz bands are used simultaneously in differing keys, with the tom-tom continuing to occupy an important place in instrumentation. Perhaps, in fact, our boy Gershwin could have learned a thing or two more about heterogeneous form from Lady Graham's cacophonous climax. If not Shirley, then perhaps Queen Zora. It is in fact likely that Gershwin somehow, someway would have encountered fellow New Yorker and fellow folklorist Zora Neale Hurston. If not in person, via Van Vechten or one of his other social buddies, then her presence most certainly would have been felt in 1930s Broadway culture in ways that may surprise him. Hurston's relationship to musical performance of the 1930s is a source of justifiably renewed scholarly interest by the likes of Anthea Kraut, fabulous book about Hurston and her musical on Broadway, Sonnet Retman, Alex Vasquez, Sonia Posmentier, and others. And her commitment to bringing black folk musicality and kinesthetic performance to New York theater precedes Gershwin's efforts officially by 3 years as well. Her ambitious New York City concert production, The Great Day, from 1932, excavates and showcases the sound as well as the movement that sits at the foundation of black vernacular cultures that she had been researching from the 1920s forward. Conceived as a day in the life of a Florida Railroad work camp community, The Great Day follows the path of musicality and expressive movement embedded in quotidian African-American labor and leisure. And it's very much a text that's intertextual with a lot of theories that she's working out and characteristics of Negro expression, what is often called the first black performance studies work of scholarship. As Kraut has shown, The Great Day went against the grain of contemporaneous black musical reviews and black folk dramas. It was dramatic without being a drama, and musical and dance-heavy without being a musical. Audiences, for instance, encountered spirituals as part of that community's religious practices with action, as Hurston later put it, and not as an extracted and isolated art form. The Great Date transitioned Hurston into an era in which she quested to cultivate and make more audible to the masses the depth and densities of Aphrodite's works on cultures. Whether Gershwin paid much active mind to Hurston's Day in the Sun, we don't know. But as Henry Louis Gates points out, Hurston was paying attention to Gershwin, and no surprise, she was not a fan. And a quick aside, Gates even provocatively speculates as to the possibility that Hurston's classic heroine, Janie Crawford, is perhaps a reimagining of Bess, and that perhaps Their Eyes Were Watching God is a reimagining of the Gershwin's opera. Very interesting points to take up and maybe discuss later on. In 1944, writing to the editor Claude Barnett, whose wife, as we'll see in a moment, was herself performing in the role of Bess, Hurston complained that Porgy and Bess, quote, is not true to our lives, and I want to do something more penetrating. Now, Gates continues by arguing that what Hurston objectified to in Porgy and Bess and other white-authored black performances was what she saw as, quote, and this is Hurston, an oversimplification of the Negro. He is either happy or low, miserable and crying. The Negro's life is neither of these, she continued in an interview. Rather, it is in between and above and below these pictures. Florence with Still, Shirley and Zora, a trifecta of sonic experimentalists who are exploring the in-between and above and below in their respective works. Each differed vastly in her aesthetic practices, but each artist also represents the ways that black women were exploring rhythmic and lyrical and formalistic alternatives to the fabulosity of contemporaneous top world blues women's performances, while nonetheless maintaining meaningful artistic conversations with Bessie and Ma and Hethel and all of them. Recuperating the archival existence of their avant-garde musical subcultures reminds us of the ways that their work looks towards the kind of Judith Jack Halberstam-ian queer time and place, where alternative temporalities take hold and which allow participants to believe that their futures can be imagined elsewhere, and what Jose Munoz might refer to as the queer utopia of what might be. Recentering them in discussions of Porgy and Bess allows us to listen for the kinds of black resonances that Rodano and Emily Rorty are tracking in their respective work. Resonances begin, as Rodano argues, with the non-sound of the performer's attack, buried in the history of transcription and cultural appropriation. And thus he urges us to engage in a form of negative listening in an effort to reveal the shadows of text arising from the sober claims of white writers. The resonances of these women's works call attention to the opaque shadow and act of Gershwin's epic. So it's a who's who of black women entertainers across the 20th century who performed in productions of Porgy and Bess. From the opera icons and musical theater actresses who've inhabited the role of the lead heroine through the years, to the myriad performers who've served in supporting roles and the all-important chorus, Abby Mitchell, Pearl Bailey, Diane Carroll, Maya Angelou, even the living is easy novelist, and think about that title, Dorothy West, was in the cast of Hayward's 1927 play, to say nothing of the magnificent, incredibly influential Eva Jesse, who served as the opera's longtime choral director. Clearly, the Gershwin's production has been a gateway for black women musical artists who've invoked a range of aesthetic practices to tackle its troubling constructions of black womanhood. Most recently, of course, the current Broadway production's women-helmed creative team and cast, led by director Diane Paulus, playwright Susie Lloyd-Harks, musical adapter Deirdre Murray, and actor-vocalist Audra McDonald and Alicia Hall Moran, they've made it a high, as well as a high-profile priority to excavate and shape and modernize, as they call it, the story, and particularly to address the archetypal bonds of Bess, a character defined by men and drugs in her original incarnation. Alice, it should be noted, offers a compelling reading of the ways that this new show succeeds in reconfiguring Bess. But up until the Paulus, Parks, and Murray endeavor, and through the years, as Rosalind's story reminds us, Bess has remained virtually unchanged. A complicated figure constantly at odds, battling between good, Porgy, and evil, crown, alienation and acceptance, virtue and immorality. But even in her best moments, she remains drug and man dependent. Her fate is predetermined, like the great tragic heroines of classic opera. She enters the play burdened by past that charts her destiny at its end. Bess does not plummet to her death, story observes, Tosca style, at the conclusion of the opera, but one need not witness Bess's death to realize that despite Porgy's quixotic promise to rescue her with the closing finale number, "Oh Lord, I'm on my way," She is heading toward a fall. She is a victim, the story continues, controlled by circumstances, and the splendor of her woes forms the essence of dramatic theater. Bess. She's the kind of figure whom historian Cheryl Hicks explores in a recent study of working-class black women in early 20th century New York, who were targets of urban and penal reform. She's the kind of woman one imagines at play's end could end up on the path to a life defined by sexual exploitation in the turn-of-the-century metropolis, as historian Cynthia Blair, in her study of black prostitution in Chicago, explores. Bess, in Gershwin and Hayward's Hot Hands, she is not a heroine able to enjoy her freedom, in the words of my colleague Tara Hunter. Yet I want to suggest that even in her original rendering, but remaining perched on the edge of the community, the edge of the play, the edge of morality, the perpetual edge of her operatic diva emotions, Bess provides a way for numerous artists to mine fraught performative spaces. And importantly here, I want to underscore the distinction between the state of Bess's being outside versus the state of being put outdoors in Toni Morrisonian terms. There is a difference, Morrison writes, in a legendary line in The Bluest Eye, in being put out and being put outdoors. If you are put out, you go somewhere else. If you are outdoors, there is no place to go. The distinction was subtle but final. Outdoors was the end of something, an irrevocable physical fact defining and complementing our metaphysical condition. So muses the narrator, Claudia. But maybe, just maybe, Bess, as outside and on the edge of the narrative, holds the potential for her to move in ways unlike the other women on Catfish Row, who, save for the capricious Clara, who rushes into a hurricane looking for her man, remain resolutely static, committed to the joys of strawberry picking and picnics. Bess is by no means free, like the old women at the close of Morrison's novel, women whose eyes bespeak a synthesized puree of tragedy and humor, wickedness and serenity, truth and fantasy. Rather, her edginess and her rough edges linger and resonate across black women's sonic histories. They perhaps evoke her constitutive resonant meaning as a character who is listening in the ways that perhaps French music theorist Jean-Luc Nancy had in mind. To be listening, Nancy claims, is always to be on the edge of meaning, or in an edgy meaning of extremity. In Gershwin's epic, Bess listens to Claire's opening summertime song before singing it herself, to Porgy's proclamations of love, to Crown's seductive come-ons, which in most versions, save for the latest, turn lightning fast into sexual perversion, to Spordenlife's call for her to follow him to New York. Tractable throughout the course of the narrative, perhaps, but in that surfeit of listening and that absorption of voices singing lullabies, love songs, and temptation songs to her, she figuratively rearranges a new musical future for the women who recover her and provide her with performative cover. What I'm suggesting here is that Bess's fate is an aesthetic, if not an historical question mark, that has inspired black women artists to worry the line, as black feminist literary critic Cheryl Wall might put it, and to worry her line, so as to sonically shake it loose from the constrictions of its putative, predetermined outcome. To worry the line of Bess, then, is to take up the black feminist literary practice that Wall cites as borrowing from blues idioms, the changes in stress and pitch, the addition of exclamatory phrases, changes in word order, repetition of phrases within the line itself, in order to retrace the under-theorized, unheralded lineage of Bess on stage and in sound recordings, to think about what this lineage means in the greater realm of black women's avant-garde musicking. We might worry her line. Following the lead of yet another French music theorist, Peter Zendi, we might ask, what scope, what space for play does Porgy and Bess reserve in itself for those black women artists who play it or hear it, for those women who interpret it with or without instruments? How, through its own construction or architecture, does a musical work, Zendi asks, keep possibilities of active appropriation in its heart, possibilities for adaptations or arrangements? What kind of sonic dramaturgy does Bess inspire? So for the remainder of my time today, I'd like to offer 4 categories of Bess performances that reveal the extent to which this challenging role serves as a portal through which black women's dissonant artistry takes flight time and again. And I'll close by turning to several vocalists and musicians who further took up this charge, spread their wings, and took to the sky. So let us listen across the century to better hear the Juilliard graduate Anne Brown, the original operatic Bess, and an artist so deeply engaged in developing this new experimental musical work with George Gershwin that he reportedly reshaped this production down to changing the name from simply Porgy to Porgy and Bess in order to better showcase his female protagonists and the women who originated the role. As Cooter Brown convincingly argues, one of the least told stories in theater history is the extent to which the original 1935 cast of the show engaged in active and ongoing artistic conversation with composer Gershwin, virtually the only member of the all-white creative team and staff to talk extensively with cast members about the work and also socialize with them regularly after rehearsals. This is not to say that Jim Crow power stratifications, that racial fetishization politics and knee-jerk authenticity politics were not at play in Gershwin's relationship with the cast, but Cooter Brown's study illuminates a much deeper and more complex aesthetic relationship that Gershwin had with African-American actors than previously assumed by scholars. At the center of this critical dynamic was Brown, who was all of 23 years old. So this was much later, the Gershwin biopic she's performing in here. She was 23 years old and 2 years into her graduate study at Juilliard when she auditioned for and won the role. Scooter Brown reveals, quote, Gershwin drew regularly on Brown's knowledge of operatic vocal ranges, as well as on her ability to sight-read freshly composed sections of the score. Brown herself proudly proclaims that, quote, no one other than his family, though strictly connected with opera, had a closer association and contact with George Gershwin while he was writing Porgy and Bess than I did. It was Brown who reportedly talked Gershwin into letting Bess sing Summertime in the third act, reprising the song the character Clara sings earlier to her baby, and turning that meditation on temporal and spatial alterity, turning that secular prayer for the next generation, what Munoz might call a longing for, a queer utopia that contains blueprints and schemata of a forward-dawning futurity, turning that anthem into a black woman's resonant echo, a call and response between two women in the context of the narrative. And Brown's work with Gershwin, as well as her character's work in the opera, thus attests to the spirit of collaboration, one of four performance paradigms emerging out of the role of Bess. In addition to Brown, let us also rediscover the quotidian activism of women like the global feminist intellectual in the making Etta Moden, who years before her diasporic travels with black newspaper entrepreneur and husband Claude Barnett, joined the 1942 revival, but refused to utter that word. Her resistance to singing 3.5 hours worth of racial epithets set in play a series of performative refusals and opened up spaces for rigorous revisionism within text by black actresses like Pearl Bailey, who starred in the '59 film and who also recorded her own Porgy and Bess album that same year. Bailey was said to have worked to excise undignified and unnatural dialect from the film script, taking it upon herself to reprimand lesser-known cast members when they aired. Moden Bailey joined Camilla Williams, the trailblazer, recently passed away, who recorded what some opera critics call the definitive Bess for Columbia, but who never agreed to perform Bess in an opera house because of her strong critical feelings about the roles. These artists also set a precedent for the great Grace Bumbry, who notoriously stood and delivered her distance from the role when she reluctantly took it on at the Met in 1985, creating a performance of operatic Afro-alienation acts. As Cooter Brown speculates, though Bumbry accepted the part, she never lost her distaste for the story, and so was unwilling to immerse herself in the role. And more than one reviewer perceived her act as self-conscious irony, a mix of putative parody, vamping, and grotesque imitation that left critics wailing for her to commit to a role that she had openly condemned as racial caricature. Together, these women generated another phase of dissonance rooted in refusals and performative revisions that subtly, quietly, and yet potently, inch by inch, calibrated the production's racial representations. Let us add to the mix Lovely Leontine, as Langston Hughes adoringly refers to her in her 1952 debut as Bess, her first major operatic role, and one in which she put everyone on notice, to cite Nikki Giovanni in another context, talking about Aretha Franklin, that she had arrived. At 24, she sat at the helm of a Cold War experiment, a State Department-sanctioned tour of the opera to Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, and across the US of A with the design of exporting cultural goodwill and musical diplomacy in the age of nuclear anxieties. By all accounts, Price's performances of Bess steered clear of this kind of satirization of State Department objectives, personnel, and protocol, and the unequivocal indictment of Jim Crow America that Satchmo and the Brubecks would innovate in their own 1962 commentary on the subject as revealed by historian Penny von Eschen. Rather, Leontine Price approached the role with what came to be known as her own brand of single-minded aesthetic drive. In this, her first lead role in an opera, Price was cultivating her trademark uniqueness as a vocalist who, as she put it, reveled in lyric with dramatic thrust. As the civil rights prima donna, Price's virtuosity executed its own form of both domestic as well as foreign diplomacy on a nightly basis, offering, as one journalist put it, an incisive detailing meant for the audience, not the wings. Her intensely immediate energy, her palpable, urgent approach to the role offered its own riposte to the insult of Jim Crow racism in 1952 Dallas, where the show played to packed houses night after night, while the cast were, of course, barred from hotels and restaurants. Price, in her 1976 Best descendant Clamet Dale, who starred in the heralded Houston Opera revival, turned the situation of performing the role itself into an extended theatrical meditation. However, Dale, a diva legend in her own right, would worry the line in an especially unconventional way, requesting of director Jack O'Brien just days before the opera's opening to reinterpolate the epithet into the production. Dale's approach to Bess resonates with elements of yet another Morrison text, that of the 1973 novel Sula, when she, Dale, describes her style of interpretation and her aim to understand the wanton Bess to the New York Times. A longer quote here, I'll read just a little bit of it. Bess is a threat to that society. It's a love-hate relationship. The women admire her for her freedom. At the same time, they hate her because she can turn their men on. What makes her sensual is not the way she walks, it's her character that makes her sexy. Dale's Bess, like Morris and Sula, this is only a few years apart that she's performing Bess after the publication of Sula. So Dale's Bess, like Morris and Sula, is, as Horton Spillers observes of the latter, a single subject, fully aware of a plenitude of predictive possibilities for good and ill. Dale's soprano voicings of plenitude would mine the putative contradictions of the 1976 Houston Opera production, the first to reestablish Porgy and Bess as a full-fledged opera after 30 years of productions that had presented the work as a musical, with most of the recitative replaced by spoken word. Her request of director O'Brien to allow the cast to restore the epithet to the libretto we might read as Dale's attempts to reanimate the latent violence of Gershwin's notation and transcriptions of black sound and speech. Her coruscating dramaturgical choices bruised rather than soothed audiences and rolled in the deep end, to cite Adele randomly, of the production's discordant genealogical roots. Clearly then, each of these artists worried about Bess and went her own distinct, resourceful, and imaginative way in worrying her line. They repurposed a text that, according to Alex Ross, had a score that invites considerable freedom of interpretation. Once the chords of Summertime start rocking, he continues, they become a steady state environment in which a gifted performer can move around at will. She can bend pitches, add ornaments, shift the line up and down. Billie Holiday and Sidney Bechet made Summertime their own. Miles Davis, on his Porgy and Bess album of '58, actually discarded Gershwin's chords and kept only the melody. The same freedom of expression is permitted in the opera's other set pieces, such as Bess, You Is My Woman, My Man's Gone Now, and It Ain't Necessarily So. It is the form, then finally, a form, originally developed in deep consultation and collaboration with Anne Brown, that begs for fluidity and movement, that beckons its own revisions and refusals, that inspires rigorous theatrical virtuosic attack in order to burst its protagonist into the realm of polyvalent representational possibility, in order to enable these women to move to a space of their own sonic creation, outside of the fictive, pastoral, and the present absence of modernity's metropolis, and toward an insistence on potentiality and a possibility for another world. I have about 2 pages left here of Coda. So the New York Times drama critic Brendan Brantley and classical music critic Anthony Tomasini don't care all that much for the current Gershwin revival. For so many reasons, but in particular they each circle around what they see as the problem of scenery. The stripped-down set, Brantley argues, begs for an elemental, timeless interpretation by the performers that the hybrid of music and dialogue doesn't allow. Transport us to another place in time, give us the busy, the ornate, the colorful Catfish Row. These kinds of critiques seem to scream. Or if you opt for the stark surroundings, keep your story legible, basic, elemental. The stripped-down set is no place for hybrid discourse. But Hilton Als sees it differently. To him, scenic designer Ricardo Hernandez's decision to take only one element of the novel's vision of this place, the jagged fourth wall, as the principal backdrop for the opening performance, intensifies the production's intimacy and creates room for Clara's opening lullaby to draw the audience into a kind of meditative calm that she conjures up, and that he likens to the mood evoked by Miles in 58. Welcome to the Black Interior, pays Elizabeth Alexander of Porgy and Bess. Hernandez, Paulus, and Hart's vision of the set design is as much jazz abstraction as it is the world once more of our beloved Morrison. Reconfigured as a gathering, a place of community, Hernandez's Catfish Row strips away that which was not essential in order to expose the humanity and emotions of these people. Hernandez explains it as, quote, that which was illustrative was abandoned in order to find something more abstract and universal, a real space made with sweat and tears, timeless in its humanity, both intimate and mythic, a space that contracts and expands, that breathes like its people. Lest we think this production is a radical non sequitur from its precedents, a travesty, a blasphemy from Sondheim's viewpoint, we might instead consider the alternative jazz women's traditions to which this new Porgy and Bess is indebted. So I would suggest finally that it is this tradition in which a series of brilliant black musicians and song stylists translated the Bess riddle into the wider pop musical landscape, both shapes and informs this current production, and suggests us the ways that black women's radical dramaturgy in relation to Gershwin extends beyond the opera hall. So, for instance, with her 1936 version of Summertime, Lady Day, 1 year removed from the Porgy and Bess premiere, audaciously and artfully streamlines the summertime melody and reminds us that she is, according to Farrah Griffin, the first really modern singer. With her careful juxtaposition of notes, her trademark subtlety, her fearlessness in running ahead of the band, at times lagging behind it at others, Holiday's voice dances with Bunny Berrigan's trumpet and basks in the luxurious dreamscape of the song. It is her sinuous, roving version of Gershwin that, as Farrah Griffin reminds me, clears the space for and inspires Miles's panoramic 1958 rendition 2 decades later. Think, too, quickly, of Ella and Louis, their 1957 Requiem for a Dream, which calls us into the symphonic jazz sanctuary, slows the tempo down to a crawl, and demands that we pay close attention to the melancholic ironies of Clara's lullaby. The fact that the living is probably anything but easy for the Sea Island's residents, and no one here is materially rich. The affective tensions bound up in this particular reading that gingerly and ever so gently swings and sways from Ella's elegant American songbook mannerisms to Pop's mischievous, NOLA, gravelly vocals and scaps, and his contemplative horn, before bringing these two opposing forms into brilliant conversation with one another as the track builds to its climax. Two languages, two musicalities, two tenderly warring souls working through the dissonance of the song together. And all hail the avant-garde time and space that Nina Simone ushers us into on her 1959 at Town Hall recording of the song, a lush and pensive, dark and stormy, cool and misty version of Summertime that literally compresses and rewrites the entire opera in 5 minutes and 33 seconds and features a 3-minute instrumental opening. Simone's vocals swing like a pendulum through and across the beat, oscillating between languid reserve and heightened drama as the song builds towards a climactic crescendo of black chromaticity that revivifies the opera's hurricane, and that in its closing jettisons the tragic ending in favor of imagining Porgy and Bess in the guise of Daddy and Mommy reunited at long last. Is it a coincidence, though, that in and around that year, 57, when the Little Rock Nine and countless other Stalwart black youths woke up every morning and faced their own mortality, attempting to go to school each day and tear down the walls of segregation that not just the First Lady of Song and Louis, the High Priestess of Soul, as well as Mahalia in 56 with her solemn and sanctified looking towards the heavens cover, or Lena Horne, her slow-burning, increasingly arch and defiant version, and finally, Sarah Vaughan. Each of these black women artists and numerous others would record Summertime in the burgeoning era of the Second Reconstruction. To many jazz purists, Sassy's 1957 cover is the definitive version of the song. Her sumptuous version showcases the contralto's signature use of the glissando, swooping and sliding between notes, and it finds her sounding out the differing dimensions of maternal care, loving, playing, teasing, assuring. But as the tune swells, to its glorious climax, becoming increasingly wishful, as she literally breaks morning and morning with a quadruple pledge, proclamation, promise, that Daddy and Mommy are standing by. Here in Sassy's hands, the time of summer is one of ambivalence, hope and yet fretfulness, aspiration and opportunity set against the backdrop of everyday terror. Our Sarah, like her sister artist, recycles and repurposes the expressive complexities bequeathed by our woman Bess and scores a civil rights sorrow song, a record of a black elder's interior concern, anxiety, and watchfulness. It is an anthem that we continue to sing today, and as we continue to wait for dawn to break anew. Thank you. Okay, yes.
So we've got about 20 minutes to take some questions.
It's like sitting through the opera, right? Yes, sir.
First of all, I'm speaking for myself, but I think for most people in this room, it seems like you've been talking for 5 or 10 minutes. This is wonderful.
Well, thank you.
I wish you could go on forever. Play more recordings.
Yeah, that would be great to play.
I have one question that I wanted to ask you, and this is not the one that I asked you before I made it, but the first one is this, and I'm curious. Porgy and Bess will be sung 100 years from now. I think everybody agrees that music is universal.
Can I do that?
Yeah. And at what point is my question is that with all the wonderful, the black experience of these terrific women who made so much of Bess, at what point, if you were looking 100 years ahead, do you have to let it go to whoever wants to sing it? I mean, is it possible to have an Asian Bess? Or a white Beaver Bess from the outside. Remember, Lady King Price went to record, she recorded Carmen. She didn't sing it, but she did a marvelous recording. On stage, she did the recording.
Yes.
Suppose a great diva who was white or Russian or Asian wanted to do Bess, and not in blackface, just in...
Right, not the Al Jolson way, because we know he actually wanted to perform in Porgy and Bess.
Well, what if she wanted to do that? And suppose there were black and white cast members mixed. I mean, do you think anything would be lost by that? Do you actually think that the opera is strong enough to make that transition?
I thank you for your question and your comment, first of all. I think what I'm trying to get at in this project is for us to think of Porgy and Bess archivally and also as kind of a record, and I mean that both as in pun and also literally, of a series of interracial and cross-cultural encounters. And that should mean that we can perform this text and interpret it in ways that allow us to hopefully better hear what has become latent in kind of the interpretations of the piece, this kind of history of the encounter, right? So I'm all for imaginative, what is that, like losing the language I want for what when you call it like alternative casting, right? I'm all for that. But what I'm most interested in is taking up the questions of the archive that are embedded in this text, and then thinking about the ways in which sonic praxis can help us to break open these questions about, archival material in new ways. So that's kind of my obsession, and so my answer would be yes. I hope in 100 years people are talking about it and performing it archivally. So thank you. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question pertaining to the end of the talk.
Yeah.
The talk was marvelous. The juxtaposition of the albums with the onset of the civil rights movement reminded me of material that was addressed by Marlon Riggs in his film Color Adjustment, which tracks the history of television.
Yes.
And it made me think of two questions. So one is whether Porgy and Bess, whether you know whether it was featured on television in the 50s or not. And then also whether you know anything about the recording history of those period pieces, because one of the things that happened on television, of course, for example, Nat King Cole lasted a year. It was yanked off by the advertiser. So I was just wondering if there was a parallel history in relation to those recordings. You might not know that stuff.
Yes. No, thank you for that question. And I left it, the albatross that I'm carrying in this piece is the film, right, which is from '59. Sydney, I referenced Sydney very quickly, but so Sydney and Portier and Dorothy Dandridge. And there was, I need to do more kind of research around how these projects came together, but there was a proliferation of recordings that were were released around the time of the film, right? So Pearl Bailey did her album. It was kind of like a companion piece to the film, which is very interesting to think about, given her kind of ambivalences about being in film. All of the cast have their ambivalences. Mahalia precedes that, but Lena and Harry Belafonte, right? Sammy Davis, also in the film cast as Sport and Life. They're all releasing these albums around '59 and '60 that seems to have something to do with responding to the film, and the dialectic between those recordings and the film I would love to think about more. But the other kind of piece that sort of lends to this sort of genealogy that I'm trying to map is Miles's recording, which is a year before the film, but he knew that the film was being made. He actually dated a woman in the Broadway cast, whose name I'm forgetting right now, but she was a dancer. He has, the production of that album also is very much bound up in his admiration for / obsession with Billie Holiday. He talks about how his kind of formative years as a jazz musician came in listening to her version of Summertime. So it's what has become kind of this growing, project has been about thinking about the cyclical ways in which trying to trace the genealogies of the novel and the play and the films, and the recordings are all deeply imbricated with one another and kind of haunt each other because of the cultural memory, right, of not just the original opera, but the book and the play which came before that. So now I'm kind of moving out into the frontier here, but it's just to say that it's a very complicated dialectical archive that I'm interested in exploring at greater length. So thank you.
Yes, George Zimmerman is being arrested, charged with the murder of Trayvon Martin.
As if it, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wanted to ask you.
They found him because he was like on the land.
Well, I didn't read the whole thing.
Okay.
I thought it'd be impolite for me to read the whole thing while listening to you. But anyway, I was wondering, you reference Ella Moulton Barnett.
Yes.
Her refusal to use certain language. We had a conversation yesterday at the Africana Center with the actors who are in the play here in Ithaca, vocology, and there's a question of, what kind of roles they would take on.
Yeah.
Were there any repercussions for either Ella Moulton Barnett or the others that you mentioned who would not play into the stereotypical type of portrayals?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, Ella Moulton, she's got an oral history at the Schlesinger Library that is worth reading and listening to. It's extraordinary. She ends up kind of moving with Claude, her partner, her life partner, also civil rights activist, newspaper entrepreneur. She ends up kind of leaving theater behind not long after her tour with Porgy and Bess, but that was a huge moment for her. So there weren't any kind of professional repercussions that came about because of her, calls for revising the script, which is ironic given the timing of the 40s and doing that. But she ends up becoming this kind of diasporic activist and a feminist, works with Gloria Steinem in the 60s, just extraordinary woman. But Camilla Williams is someone who is distinct in this particular, part of the narrative because she was an opera singer, just considered, broke all these boundaries before Marian Anderson, singing at New York City Opera. So she becomes the first African-American opera singer to sing for a major company before Marian Anderson. They were friends. And there was a real kind of energy and excitement around her possibilities for being this kind of crossover figure, whatever that means, right, in the 40s and 50s. And they very much wanted her to perform Bess. And so she always, she would not do anything but record it. And I think that that's, a story of a great woman who had a fantastic life as an artist in opera, but, was confined to that realm because she refused to give up her principles around why she would perform in the opera on stage. So thank you.
I've got two figures in mind, one of whom you mentioned, that one of whom you didn't for understandable reasons. But I'm wondering about the relationship of Abby Lincoln to anything that you talk about.
Oh my God.
Because
everything I talk about.
For instance, the rejection of that role.
Yep.
I don't know the history, but
Yeah.
there was a certain point in her career early on where
Yes.
Dorothy Dandridge, you mentioned, Abby Lincoln would have been the next person to fill
Yes,
that role.
right. No, right. I mean, she kind of breaks in through supper club singing. Farrah Griffin has written beautifully about this.
Yeah.
She's in The Girl Can't Help It, a kind of weird early, rock and roll film that Little Richard is in, but she actually wears a dress that was Marilyn Monroe's.
Yeah.
So I don't know the history of whether or not she may have been approached to play Bess. I know since Otto Preminger had a very problematic relationship with Dorothy Dandridge, I think it was always her role initially. But she's an interesting figure to keep in mind with regards to especially the women that I try to focus on in the latter portion of the project, in the sense that her kind of immersion in bebop vocal experimentalism, of course with Max Roach, and most famously on Straight Ahead, and We Insist, and the triptych Scream that many people have written about, I think runs parallel to the kind of formalistic experimentalism that I'm interested in hearing how these other women are working through and with in their own interpretations of Gershwin. So thank you for bringing her up.
Then the other person I had in mind was Jean Lee, who, as far as I know, didn't touch material like this at all. So
That's really
you've
interesting.
got a really interesting
Yeah.
measuring device here, or
Yeah.
archive.
Jean Lee,
Because
wow,
it does point to a different tradition that just said, I'm not going to have anything to do with it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really, like I said early on, I'm just trying to work with what it means to try and question the ways that sonic forms may have had, and sonic forms may have interacted with literary and theatrical constructions of Black womanhood in really just generative ways that yielded something dissonant, something unsettling, something that allowed Black women to sound and move in unconventional and sometimes coruscating ways. And I think the irony, or maybe actually it's not so ironic, the fact that this particular text that has this blackface genealogy and a genealogy of interracial encounters sort of lends itself ironically, I keep saying ironically, so I need to unpack that, but lends itself to kind of these wide open spaces of experimental questioning and interrogation that you can hear these artists sounding out. And I'm interested in that. I will say this is kind of not what you're asking, but it's something that's just been on my mind and working on this text that I keep coming back to Morrison's fiction and thinking about the ways that she, is doing certain things with form and also with whiteness that I think is somehow in conversation with this kind of broad aesthetic tradition that I'm examining. So, thank you.
I was wondering, thank you first of all for such a totally rich and fantastic talk, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit more about your method and this intersection of sonic praxis and the archive. And I guess I'm wondering the ways in which an emphasis on sonic praxis actually, of course, shapes, forms, changes, mutates the archive, and I don't know how that's playing out for you.
You're kind of answering it right, but it's something I'm just kind of really pushing to work through right now, and it came from, you know, my kind of history of working with 19th century texts that are engaged in sound, but working with kind of texts that you don't have the sound for, and so trying to think counterintuitively about how to both methodologically retrace and map out sonic histories without sound. And so that requires, at least right now for me methodologically, something that I'm always geeked out on doing, which is to look at spectatorial experiences, or I should say the audible experiences that are transcribed, notated by audience members, right? So it's kind of like I'm citing Peter Zindi and Jean-Luc Nancy, these French theorists who were, and we're doing like brilliant work with theories of listening, and that led me towards just thinking more about trying to detail, the space in between, right, the performance and the spectator listener. And if I'm doing that, then I'm thinking about the dynamic of performance, how the performer is approaching a text, and imagining the ways that they might be listening to that text and arranging it. I'm going around a little bit in circles right now, but I'm trying to actually map out the ways that I kind of come to thinking about these performative scenes. Okay, there's not just a black female musician here, right? But there's a black female musician who's listening to Gershwin and the Haywards, who are listening to the black folks in the Mass on the Gullah Sea Islands, right? So it's kind of this dialectical kind of cultural landscape of listening and also looking, right? And putting all of this sort of intersecting sensory experiences together. So that's kind of where I'm at with it, but thank you for that question. It's something I'm looking at.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's been really great. You haven't talked too much about some of the singing conventions that change when you move from the stage, from the operatic stage to recordings.
Yes.
The ability to croon
Right.
Summertime, for example.
Right.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah. I sort of sat for a minute in the piece with Miles's 58 because of the ways that it gets talked about so much as, jettisoning so much of Gershwin's score and leaving just kind of the stripped down and structure, right? Which of course lends itself to this kind of bebop moment of him, enacting new modes of improvisation. So for me, the leap that I was trying to make was to think about what was embedded in the original score, the fluidity of the original score that Alex Ross talks about, the jazz musicians took up and opened up in a variety of ways. So Nina, in particular, is someone who, will make use of her vibrato and sit on notes and drag them out and create this kind of unsettling, kind of disruptive sonic landscape. Very different from opera. I don't want to say too much about this, and there are a lot of people who I think can speak to the opera side of this in much more sophisticated ways than I could at this point. But the way that this project is working right now in my book is to kind of think about a jazz chapter that's about jazz having the jazz women's genealogy coming out of a different kind of musical genre. So I need to do a lot more work on that, but at least where I'm ending up is just thinking about what Gershwin's, hybrid, heterogeneous informed text enabled and allowed and created for these jazz women to kind of break open these new kinds of affective modes of vocalizing that one hears in the song stylists of the 50s and the 60s. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Just as a follow-up,
Yes.
just from my perspective,
Yeah.
it seems that there is something on display when you're singing to an operatic house,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
That is different from the kind of almost reclamation that you can make of these musics in an intimate setting recording.
That's really, thank you, that's really interesting. I mean, I should police myself and say I don't want to conflate all of these different musicians and song stylists, right? I mean, Nina coming out of Brechtian, kind of pseudo-Atlantic City cabaret, right, but also a classical training, very different from Billy's, upbringing or Sarah's training. So that's something I really need to continue to work on. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Last question.
Thank you very much. I think my notes are longer than most papers that I have given recently. I was wondering in looking at the visuals how the sonic practice engages with some of the Scothic register of Porgy and Bess, both in the staging and the costume. I was really struck with kind of the red dress that it keeps reappearing and reappearing, and I guess what is the relationship between those I mean, not that there's one, but there's definitely multiple, I think, happening, and why that staging, the absence of staging seems to cause such consternation.
Yes.
Is it part
Right.
does it alter the relation with the sound and the
Oh my
perception of the
God,
sound?
wow. That's great. Yeah, I mean, the contemporary kind of, the current moment, the problem for many of the critics of this new production is that it's not visually ornate, right? That's a problem for them because they have these ideas about what Catfish Row is supposed to be. And I guess I'll have to think more about, the ways that embodiment and sartorial choice lends itself to the different affective modes of sonic expression that one can see in different versions of Bess. I'm trying to think about this more, like the different ways that Dandridge takes up this role, kinesthetically, right? As opposed to Audra, who's very still. I don't know if anyone has seen the contemporary production, but a very kind of still interpretation of the role, which I think has a lot to do with the stripped down version, right, of the scenic design. Let me think about that a little more. That is so great, Val. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm gonna think about that. Okay. Yeah.
Before I ask everyone to join me in thanking our speaker, I'd like to ask everyone to join us at a reception just down the hall in the History of Art Gallery, at which you could continue some of these conversations. But for now, join me in thanking Professor Daphne Brooks.